Andrea?
Hello. Whole grains, the best kept culinary secret. That is a really good formal title for what I'm going to talk about. But as I sat down to write it, I realized that that's more the story that I'll be talking about. Whole grains for the reluctant. Because there are people who eat whole grains all the time. And they're on board. But then there are other people who it just never comes up. They're not particularly interested in improving their diets, maybe, or they're not interested in the sustainability argument. And so how do we persuade those people to eat whole grains? That's what I'll talk about. So I want to be clear. I want to come clean at the beginning. I am not a whole grains expert. I'm a recipe expert. If I'm an expert in anything, I'm an expert in recipes. I'm in the business of getting people excited about cooking, of helping home cooks feel more confident and proficient and skillful in the kitchen. So professionally, I'm not at all invested in getting people to improve their diets. My aim isn't to get people to cook more whole grains. My aim is to get more people to cook. And I do that by developing recipes that, as Sarah said, are approachable and achievable, and of course they have to be delicious. But here's the thing. Using whole grains and whole grain flours is actually a really good way of making a recipe more achievable and more approachable and just plain easier. And that's because whole grains can make cooking and baking easier, quicker, and more foolproof. And foolproof is key. Foolproof recipes give people confidence. And so if you can tell them that using whole grain flour will actually make the outcome more positive and more delicious, then they might start listening to you, even if they're not interested in a health outcome. So I'm going to tell you about some recipes that I've developed that have showcased the culinary advantages of whole grains. But first, just to put it in context, I am going to talk a little bit about Cook's Illustrated magazine, which is where I've worked for 10 years. As you can see, we've just celebrated our 25th anniversary. We're part of America's Test Kitchen. You might be familiar with the America's Test Kitchen television show that's on PBS. That television show is based on the recipes from Cook's Illustrated. It's a really unusual cooking magazine. It's really very much an anomaly because we only publish 6 times a year, so every other month, and every issue has only 10 recipes, just 10, compared to 50, 60, 70 in other cooking magazines that come out every single month. We just have 10. And this is what 2 pages in Cook's Illustrated looks like. So as you can see, there's a recipe over there to the right. But then there's this whole bit where we're explaining the reasoning behind the recipe, why we made the choices that we did. We have sidebars that explain the science or the history, or maybe show, in this case, it's a recipe, suitably enough, it's a recipe for grain bowls that I did for the upcoming issue. But there's something that shows sort of the flow of the recipe, because when you look at that picture, you think, oh, that looks really complicated. So then you look at the sidebar, and it just shows how it all sort of flows and fits together. So that's what every one of the 10 recipes has. Because we do such a small number of recipes, we have to make sure that every single one of them is a home run. And so to do that, we have to be in constant communication with our readers. And we do that through surveys. We survey readers as much as they will tolerate. We survey them about prospective recipe ideas. We do shopper surveys. So we ask them, can you find halibut at your supermarket? Can you find tilapia at your supermarket? Can you find gochujang at your supermarket? Because we can't call for ingredients that most of our readers can't get, because that doesn't make them feel good about cooking. So we want to make sure everything is super accessible. We also do equipment surveys, so we know what our readership has in their kitchens. We know what percentage of them have gas ovens versus electric ovens. We know how many people have immersion blenders versus conventional blenders, and how many people have both. How many people have a 12-inch cast iron skillet. We know all that, so we know what to ask people to use in our recipes. The last one is post-publication survey. So even after the issue is published, we're still not satisfied. We survey them, say, what did you think of the issue? We go through every single story, what resonated with people, what didn't, and we use that information for our future issues. The fourth one, the recipe testing survey, that's a huge one. Every single recipe, every one of those 10 recipes in every issue goes through a very serious recipe testing process. Now, in-house at America's Test Kitchen, which is in Boston, we test the recipe exhaustively for sure. But then many months before it's published, we send it out to volunteer testers across the country. And they make it at their own expense, in their own time, in their own kitchens. God love them, because they're very important to our process. And then they report back about how it worked. For instance, I recently developed a recipe for peanut butter cookies. We sent it out to a couple of thousand people. Not everybody makes every recipe, so 192 people made that recipe before it was even published. So we have a very good idea of how it's going to be received when it is published. The most important question that they answer on the survey is, would you make this recipe again? And if fewer than 80% of the respondents say that they would make the recipe again, we have to go back to the kitchen and fix it. And then we survey it again. And if it doesn't get 80%, we go back to the kitchen again, because we have to make sure that every recipe is a home run. So why am I telling you about all these surveys? The surveys are really important because they give us something that I don't think other publishing companies necessarily have. They give us a window into people's kitchens. They give us insight into how people really cook, and they give us an understanding of the factors that govern what people decide to cook. In addition to surveys, we're also very much in touch with our readers through social media, as every company must be these days. I recently posed a question. We have a private members page on Facebook, and I posed the question, do you cook and bake with whole grains? If not, why not? I got some interesting responses, and I think they'll probably sound familiar to a lot of you. Somebody said, as a new baker, I'm intimidated to try whole wheat recipes, as I'm afraid it will turn into a solid mess. Somebody else said, I would love to incorporate them more, but my mother-in-law is stopping me. She refuses to eat whole wheat anything. And something that somebody said that I think is true of a lot of people, I think knowing how to use them in the recipes my family already enjoys so that they will welcome them more into their lives, that's my struggle. We aren't a family that lives a 100% organic, made-from-scratch life. We'd love to, but it isn't practical at this stage. And we're always looking for more balanced ways to make our favorite foods more healthy. This was my favorite one. I have some einkorn in my basement, but it intimidates me. And which is funny, but it's also actually true. A lot of people are they have this nagging feeling that they should be eating more whole grains, but they're not eating them because they have worries associated with whole grains. Basically, they're worried that whole grains might taste bad. They're worried that whole grains aren't compatible with the foods that they love and that they know and with which they're familiar. They don't think of themselves as whole grains people. They think it sort of signifies a whole lifestyle that they can't live up to. They think that they have practical concerns. They think that whole grains take forever to cook. They think that they're easy to mess up. They think that when it comes to baking, they think that whole grain flour will make their baked goods heavy and dense and tough. And so how do we get them to overcome these worries? we give them good recipes. I'm going to talk about 2 recipes in particular that sort of changed not only the way our readers felt about whole grains, but actually changed the way we at Cooks Illustrated felt about whole grains. It all started with fried rice. Back in 2014, the reader surveys indicated that they wanted a recipe for fried rice, which might seem kind of innocuous to you, but as the test cook to whom that was assigned, it was really scary. And that's because there are a couple of challenges there. Fried rice is something that people don't generally make at home, so they're unfamiliar with some of the requirements of the ingredients. It's something that people can buy pretty inexpensively, so they can get it pretty quickly. So why do they want, it has to be really good to be able for you to make it at home. When it comes to the special requirements of the ingredients, people don't realize that when you make fried rice with white rice, you have to use white rice that has been cooked and then cooled before you fry it. And that's because white rice is just the exposed endosperm of the grain, right? And so it's very delicate when it's just freshly cooked and warm. And so what you do is you cook it through the absorption method, which is also kind of a pain because you have to have this perfect mix, perfect proportion of water to rice to heat to make it cook perfectly, and you can't stir it because it'll break. So that's sort of fraught anyway. And then you have to cook it, you have to spread it out on a tray, and you have to cool it. And only then the starches retrograde. And again, you guys are more familiar with this than I am, but my understanding is that the starches recrystallize, and that makes the grains firmer, and that is what makes them able to withstand the vigorous stir-frying process, and also makes them not absorb every bit of oil and sauce so they get all mushy. So in this recipe, you would have to take 30 minutes to cook your white rice. Then you'd have to take at least an hour to chill your white rice, or at least let it cool and stiffen up a bit. And only then could you start making your fried rice. So we're looking at fried rice that you can either order in 10 minutes from the place down on the corner, or you can take 2 hours to make it at home. Do you think that recipe is going to get 80% make again on the survey? It is not, I can tell you from experience. So that moved me to make an unusual suggestion for CI in 2014. At that point, Cooks Illustrated hadn't done much in terms of whole grains. I think we had done a single brown rice recipe in which we had baked the brown rice. So we had cooked it through absorption, but we had taken some of the anxiety out of it by doing it in the oven. But that was it in its 20-year history. But at the edit meeting on that Tuesday morning, when I had to talk about fried rice, I said, hey, here's a crazy idea. Maybe we should use brown rice. But it turns out it's not that crazy. Brown rice has some distinct advantages when it comes to this recipe, and those advantages have nothing to do with nutrition and everything to do with the bran. I'm going to start with the middle one. Because the rice is encased in bran, the endosperm is encased in the bran, you can cook the heck out of it and you won't harm it. So you can cook not only brown rice, but a lot of whole grains. You can cook them using what we call the pasta method, because it's just like pasta. You bring your water to a boil, you chuck the grains in, you cook them until they're soft, and you drain them and you're done. So that's advantage number one. Advantage number two is you can take that grain, still steamy and warm from the colander, and you can throw it right into your wok. You don't have to do the cooling, retrograding step, because again, that bran protects it. So it's not going to clump together, it's not going to stick, it's not going to break apart. It's really sturdy. So that's another advantage. So we saved some time there. And then the last one is that you don't have to use as much oil. When you use white rice, you do have to use a fair amount of oil, even when you've staled the rice, because the starch wants to stick to each other. The grains want to stick to each other, and they want to stick to the wok or the skillet. So you have to use quite a bit of rice and quite a lot of heat. Sometimes, if you have an electric cooktop, you don't have enough heat. So in this case, you can use less oil, and you can probably, you don't need a jet-powered wok either. So you can use less oil. And I have found that even if people don't express an interest in eating a healthier diet, almost anybody would prefer to use 2 tablespoons of oil instead of 4 tablespoons or 6 tablespoons. So it was actually a really popular recipe. It did well on the, I just wanted to check this one. So this is one of the 2 major messages that I would like you to take from my presentation. This is the first one. And happily, this is actually, it turns out I was looking through my program, and this is on page 29 of your program in one of those infographics. But whole grains, many whole grains are as easy to cook as pasta. You boil them, you drain them, and you're done. And you might know that, but a lot of people don't know that and are very pleased to hear that. So that's something to remember. So this recipe was super easy. You get your rice boiling. While it's boiling, you're stir frying some shrimp and some eggs. This is another thing that we try to tell people in the magazine. Just because you're using whole grains doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a very aesthetic dish, a very abstemious dish. You can put some really nice, delicious, and indulgent sort of things with whole grains as well. I actually just developed a recipe for whole grain pie doughs that are delicious, and it's amazing what 2.5 sticks of butter does to the flavor of rye flour. It's really good. So so they don't have to be really aesthetic. So you can add your pork. You cook the pork. You're putting everything in a bowl because your skillet isn't very big. You cook your aromatics, ginger, scallions, garlic. You add that warm, steamy rice that you didn't have to wait for it to retrograde. You throw that in. You add some soy sauce, some hoisin sauce, all that kind of good stuff. Then you add everything else back, mix it all through, and you're done. And it doesn't really take that long. It certainly didn't take 2 hours. So it did get the 80% make again on the survey. And readers really liked it. They said things like, so in the recipe survey, they said things like, I jumped for joy about this method for cooking the rice. I love brown rice, but I hate cooking it the usual way. It was so nutty and perfectly soft. We all agreed that we preferred the firmer texture of brown rice to traditional white rice. And that's what it looked like. Somebody said that using brown rice made the dish more flavorful and substantial. It was also an easy meal to prepare on a weeknight. So those are all messages that we want to send about whole grains. So with that one recipe, I had dispelled 4 myths about cooking with whole grains. That whole grains taste bad, that whole grains are difficult to cook, that whole grains take too long to cook, and that whole grains don't go with the foods that I know and love. So I was on a roll, so then I moved on to pancakes. It was the same issue, and this is actually when Kelly contacted me, she was probably like, there's a whole grains fanatic at CI, but it actually just worked out that way. Now I have to admit that my decision to use whole wheat flour actually started as a bit of a cop-out, because as I explained, our content at Cooks Illustrated is completely dictated by our readership. And so they indicated that they wanted a recipe for pancakes. We deliver them a recipe for pancakes. The problem is that we had been around for 20 years at that point, and we had done pancakes. We had done pancakes a lot. And because we have a website where all the recipes live forever, we can't repeat ourselves. And so every time you get something like a core recipe for something like pancakes, you have to think of a new angle. So I thought, well, maybe we'll do it with whole wheat. We had done something, we had dabbled. We had done a multigrain pancake that had some multigrain cereal mixed in, but it wasn't a 100% whole wheat pancake. So I decided I would try that. If I could get it through survey, I'd have some interesting stuff to talk about in the story. So what would people worry about in this case? They might worry that whole wheat pancakes would taste bad. Without meaning to, I had dodged that issue with the fried rice because fried rice has so many delicious things in it that even if the short grain brown rice hadn't tasted good, there was no way that you would ever know. But with pancakes, the flavor is going to be front and center. So they have to taste good. And that's going to be people's number one concern, is that they're not going to taste good. And that they would also worry that whole wheat pancakes will be dense and tough because, as we all know, anything made with whole grain flour is like a brick, right? So that's what people think anyway. So let's talk about the flavor first. I'll just talk about this briefly. I do think that sometimes whole wheat flour gets a bad rap because people say that it tastes bitter. And it is true that it has a hint of bitterness from the phenolic acid that's in the bran, so you can taste it when it's milled. And so even freshly milled whole wheat flour has a little bit of that flavor. I think that it actually works with the broad spectrum of flavors that you get in whole wheat flour, and I think that it gives it character and dimension. But sometimes what people do is they buy a 5-pound bag of whole wheat flour because it's more economical to buy it that way. They use a little bit in a recipe. They put it in their cupboard and they forget about it for months. And then they come back and they're going to use it in a recipe, and they all of a sudden decide, oh, I don't like the way this tastes. It tastes bitter. And so I think some of the perception that whole wheat flour doesn't taste good is actually that rancid whole wheat flour doesn't taste good. And I don't like rancid whole wheat flour either, so I don't blame them. But we have this head note now it started with the whole wheat pancakes, but now every recipe in which we use whole wheat flour, we say, to ensure the best flavor, use either recently purchased whole wheat flour or flour that's been stored in the freezer, not the fridge, for less than 12 months. So that seems to help with the flavor. And then there are the textural concerns. People think that whole grains are, that whole wheat flour is going to make their baked goods punishingly dense and heavy and tough. And this is going to be an unpopular take in this room, but I'm going to say it out loud. They're not completely wrong. That can be the case in terms of a very limited number of recipes. If you have whole grain yeasted breads, 100% whole grain yeasted breads, where you don't take the proper steps to manage the whole wheat flour and to coax it along, then the volume can be reduced and they can be a bit dense. And that's because the volume of yeasted bread is dependent on gluten development, and the bran in whole grain flour makes it difficult for the gluten strands to remain intact. Unless you sift out the bran or you soak it, and that's a very popular, and we've done that with whole wheat bread at ATK. If you soak the flour, you can soften the bran. It hydrates a bit and it softens, and so then it's not as injurious to the gluten network. But if you don't do that, it's sort of the bran is sort of the enemy of the kind of stretchy, extensible gluten network that traps air and gives bread good volume and lightness, and gives first-time bakers that feeling of accomplishment, like, look how big it got. If they get a small volume loaf, they might not feel that way. But here's the thing. For quick breads like pancakes, it's actually gluten that's the enemy. And so if bran is the enemy of gluten, then bran is your friend when it comes to muffins and pancakes and quick breads. So if you think over any pancake or muffin recipes that you've made, they often have the warning. In some way they say, do not overmix. It might say, stir only until streaks of flour remain, or the batter will be lumpy. And those are the kind of things that make home cooks nervous, because they're very subjective and they're very imprecise. How lumpy is lumpy? How big should the streaks of flour be? How will I know if I've overmixed it? So it's important in white pancakes not to overmix it, because if you overmix it, that gluten network will get pretty strong, and it can actually restrict the air bubbles expansion, and then it can hinder the rise. It can make your pancakes chewy. But this is a sidebar that we ran with the whole wheat pancake story, because the bran in whole grain flour actually limits the formation of a strong gluten network, and so you can actually mix it with impunity. and it will still continue to be light and fluffy because the bran is sort of regulating the formation of gluten. So on the left, we have white flour pancakes that we stirred for 25 times very carefully. The batter was lumpy, all that. And then we had one that we just went to town on and stirred it 100 times. And as you can see with the second batch, it's the same number of pancakes. They're flatter, and they don't look as attractive. They probably wouldn't eat as nicely. But we did the same thing with the whole wheat flour, and it was 100% whole wheat, and they were pretty much the same. So that's the second big message, and conveniently, it is also on page 29 of your program. But whole grain flour makes quick breads, muffins, and pancakes lighter and more tender, and this is key, more foolproof. So we got a lot of good comments on this one. Oh, it was really easy because you don't have to worry about overmixing it, right? So it was just flour, sugar, salt, mix those together. And then it was some oil and some buttermilk, and mix those in, and some eggs. And then you just make the pancakes. And they were really popular. People said things like, my husband and I love this recipe, and we'll never go back to white flour. It's very light, but more flavorful. It's a great recipe, and learning about why whole wheat flour gets bitter was very interesting. There they are. Somebody said, my favorite pancake recipe, bar none. It comes together quickly. It's impossible to overstir, and the resulting pancakes are nice and fluffy with that beautiful, nutty whole wheat flavor. So that's my tale of two recipes. If you're in the business of selling whole grains or persuading people to improve their diets, or even if you're like me in the business of making recipes that get people excited about cooking, please remember to spread the word. Whole grains can make cooking and baking easier, quicker, and more foolproof. Even if you don't talk about nutrition, those are important things for people to know, and those are really persuasive things for people to know. And if we're really diligent about spreading that message, I'm confident that we will eventually get whole grains well into the mainstream, and that hopefully we can get that einkorn out of the basement and into the kitchen where it belongs.